Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where stupid shit ensues. But yesterday I beat a video game, or last night I should say I beat a video game, and so I kind of want to talk about because I kind of liked it, I kind of enjoyed it. I haven't seen a lot of people talk about it. It has been a few years since it came out, but last night I beat Destiny Connect Tick-Tock Travelers for the Nintendo Switch. As far as I know, this only came out on the Switch and the PS4. It came out in like 2019, so it's been a few years since it has came out. Even back then, not a lot of people were talking about it because it was kind of a low-key release, but the game is published and developed by Nippon Ichi Software, or NIS as we know them. The game took me 20 hours. It's about 17 chapters long, and overall the long and short of my opinion is that it's a pretty overlooked JRPG, and it's pretty fun. Now, is it absolutely blow my mind amazing and everyone's gotta play it? No, but it's a pretty low-key release, and all things considered, considering it's 20 hours, which is pretty short for a JRPG, it's worth playing if you see it at a discount. But starting out with the graphics, I usually don't really care about them. This game does have a pretty interesting graphical aesthetic though. It kind of looks like an early to mid 2000s animated movie kind of aesthetic. So really what I was thinking like was something like Meet the Robinsons is kind of what the graphics look like. It's kind of got this chibi graphical vibe to it. Not the most amazing looking game, but honestly I kind of like the graphical aesthetic. It's kind of unique. You don't really see that graphical aesthetic very much. It does kind of hamper the game in the fact that it makes it look kind of like a kid's game. Even though anyone of all ages can enjoy it, it makes it look like it's more targeted towards a younger audience. But the game as well runs fine on the Switch. It holds a stable 30. Frame dips are very infrequent. They happen so infrequently that I don't even remember them that much. I can only recall maybe 3 times when I remember the frame dips being really bad, but otherwise the frame rate was fine, which is appreciated for a Nintendo Switch game considering some devs decide to kind of skimp on the Switch ports. But the graphics are kind of somewhat rough with like render distances and jagged edges, but really I don't care. If that is something you care about, just know that the game does have some rough graphical aesthetics at points, but in my opinion the graphics are fine. So overall the graphics were alright, and I think the aesthetic was actually pretty neat all things considered, since we don't see it that often in JRPGs or video games in general really. Now in terms of the music and voice acting, the music, considering it's a budget JRPG, is actually banger as hell. And it's actually surprising because I went into this game not really expecting a crazy good soundtrack. There are some budget sounding songs in here, so the whole entire soundtrack isn't amazing, but there are some really good songs in this soundtrack. The battle theme is really good. One of the boss themes is just fantastic. They use it throughout the game, but it is so good with the opener just because of how tense the notes are. It just opens up with the piano with like tense and frantic notes for the boss battle, and makes the beginning of the boss battles feel pretty tense. That song is neat. The kind of relaxed songs are nice as well. The happy songs are nice. The kind of sad songs are really good as well, especially one of the ones near the opening, near the beginning of the game, makes it feel like really hopeless and kind of makes you feel like a sense of despair with not knowing what's going on in the world. There's some really good songs in this soundtrack, and it's surprising all things considered. Like I said, it's a budget JRPG, but it's actually got a lot of bangers in its soundtrack. So in terms of the soundtrack, this game is actually surprisingly good. In terms of the voice actors, I have nothing to say because there are no voice actors in Destiny Connect. This is actually kind of a weird surprise. Even in other budget NIS games, they have voice acting, but this game has absolutely no voice acting at all. No Japanese voice acting, no English voice acting, nada. And that's a big surprise, and really that's one of the big gripes I have about this game. I feel like it hurts from not having voice actors in it. When you don't have voice actors in a game, it's hard to express how a character acts or their emotions. How they do it in this game is through animation. They have over empathized animations for the characters so they can display their emotions. They do over exaggerated emotions and like motions and shit to express their feelings. But I feel like voice actors should have been in this game. Whether or not they would have been good or bad, it wouldn't have really have mattered. It would have at least given the characters a solid ground to operate off of to build their characters. But that is definitely the biggest gripe I have about this game, is the lack of voice actors makes it feel like some moments are kind of lost because you really just don't get the emotion from it because there's just no voice actors to bring out the emotions. So in terms of the soundtrack and voice actors, I really like the soundtrack. This is actually a great soundtrack. Blown away by it kind of, because I did not expect anything from the soundtrack and I got way more than I expected from it. In terms of voice actors, like I said, there are none, which is kind of a bummer, and it actually kind of hurts the game. But in terms of story and characters, the story is kind of interesting, kind kind of simple at first, but it actually kind of picks up near the end and gets pretty good. But the story is pretty much that you play as a young girl named Sherry. You also meet a couple other characters along the way, like Pagrio and a robot named Isaac. But on January 1st, 2000, in this game, time stops in the town of Clockney. The machines descend upon the town and pretty much start attacking people. The cast of Sherry, Isaac, and Pagrio, and eventually a couple other characters, essentially start traveling through time to attempt to figure out why time stopped in the year 2000 and how they can pretty much restore time and stop the end of the world. It's kind of an interesting story. Time traveling is kind of a unique take in the JRPG genre, not a crazy unique take because it has been done before, but it is interesting to be seen done in this game. I feel like the setting kind of helps it because Clockney, the town the entire game is based in, is pretty much kind of based on like this steampunk London type of vibe or like an England type of vibe, which is kind of cool. I won't lie, the theme is kind of cool with the kind of steampunk aesthetic. Also not seen very often in JRPGs, so kind of the setting helps the story as well. But like I said, the story is kind of simple. It does pick up near the end and get kind of more complex. I enjoyed the story nonetheless. It is an enjoyable story. Will I remember it for years to come? Probably not. It is kind of a childish story at some points, and it does kind of have a movie happy ending that's feel good and everything, but the story was pretty enjoyable, I won't lie. But like I said, it has its deeper moments kind of near the end of the game rather than near the front of the game. About, I would say, maybe 2/3 of the way through, the game actually starts to kind of build up on its story and pick up. For the first 2/3, it's alright, but I would say probably the last third of this game is where the story really starts to pick up. That being said, the story never really drags though, so it's fine. In terms of the characters are pretty much all young kids essentially. So Sherry, Pagrio, a couple other characters you meet, they're all kids, and so they kind of act childish, and this game likes to use a lot of tropes. The characters are cool. They don't have amazing development throughout the entire story. The adult characters kind of phase in and out. By far the best character in this game is kind of the mad scientist character known as Cheatstein. His personality comes out the most through the text. Like I said, there's no voice actors, so their characters are kind of hurt by that, but his kind of goofy mad scientist character is the one that's played up the most and played up the best by far. Other than that, the kind of cast of children are alright. Like I said, they don't have crazy character developments and they do what they do. Isaac, the robot, and pretty much the protagonist of this game, has an alright character as well. The only complaint I have about his character really is that near the end is when his character is really developed. Otherwise, he's kind of left as a robot, as you would expect, but the characters are alright. They do their part. They carry their way through the story. I feel like the characters, kind of like the story, pick up near the end of the game rather than near the beginning of the game. They all have pretty basic characters at the beginning of the game. Once you get near the end though, their characters start to pick up and kind of develop. But in terms of the story and characters, I think the setting of the game is very unique. The setting of this kind of steampunk London, and as well the kind of time traveling mechanic tied into the story is kind of cool. The overarching story, like I said, doesn't pick up till the end of the game as well. The characters are pretty good, but like I said, they don't pick up until near the end of the game. Now in terms of gameplay, this game is pretty basic in terms of gameplay, I would say, but that's appreciable. It's a decent game, and the gameplay is still pretty good nonetheless. The game's split between two parts, which is pretty much your combat and then kind of crawling through dungeons, or really not crawling through dungeons but exploring Clockney, because you don't really dungeon crawl that much. There's a couple of dungeons, but for the most part you're exploring Clockney and battling enemies. It's kind of done the style of, like, I would say Death End Request, how I remember it, except Clockney is a lot more open than the environments in Death End Request. Clockney is kind of interesting to explore. The town of Clockney is not crazy big, but it's big enough that you can do enough exploring, but also small enough that you won't be getting lost at any point during the game. I can kind of appreciate it. It's not the most interesting town to explore, but the environments are still enjoyable nonetheless, and they're varied enough that it's still enjoyable to explore. Now, exploring Clockney, you also engage in battles with enemies in the town of Clockney and also in the outskirts of Clockney. You see the enemies on the map, which I appreciate. You're going to pretty much just see every enemy you're going to engage with. It's not a random battle type of deposition. The only thing I can really complain about in that regard is the fact that the game kind of has a preemptive battle system where you can run into an enemy from behind and engage them in battle. This system is very finicky though, because if you hit them anywhere but a dead center in their back, it will not engage the preemptive strike mechanic in the game. It's kind of weird, but I imagine it'd be a minor gripe for many. Now, the combat in the game is just turn-based combat. It is very basic in terms of turn-based combat as well. It really does nothing crazy in terms of the turn-based combat, and honestly, it's pretty easy as well. The game only gets hard in the final dungeon and then the final boss battle, which is when this game really gets a weird difficulty spike, to be honest. Like, during the entire game, I had no problems with it. It was relatively easy up until the final dungeon and like some of the final boss battles, which were actually surprisingly hard. Other than that, though, the game is really easy. The game lets you grind out levels really early on in the game too. The game's level cap is level 50, and you can level cap like really early on in the game. Like I said, the game has 17 chapters. I think I level capped around chapter 10. You can level cap out really early. I feel like that's why the game becomes so hard later on, is because you cap out so early that once you get to the late game and the game starts getting harder, you just have no way to build up your power besides like upgrading your armor. It's really weird that the game had such a low level cap. I feel like it would have benefited from having a higher level cap. The turn-based combat really isn't anything crazy to talk about. I'll say that the sound effects for the attacks though are really punchy, and they make the turn-based combat feel really satisfying though. But it's a really basic turn-based combat. The only thing I can really mention about it is that Isaac, the robot in the game, can change forms, so to speak. So he can change to different forms that have different strengths and weaknesses, and can also use different abilities. And these abilities can also be upgraded with gears that you find throughout the world. That's kind of a cool concept, but really it does not much for the game. And honestly, I only found myself using his one form very often, and he has 6. And I feel like that's because the game really wasn't long enough. I felt like I found one good form of his to use, and I just stuck with it. Now, that being said, the game does encourage you to use all of the forms because it lets you switch forms on the fly in battle without penalty. You don't lose a turn for switching a form. You can just switch it whenever you want. So that's kind of cool, but like I said, I didn't find myself using it all that often. But in terms of the gameplay, I found the world exploring to be pretty enjoyable. There aren't any real side missions in this game, so it's pretty linear. There are some strong enemies scattered throughout the world that you can battle, but besides that, the game is pretty linear, even though it has a pretty open world that you can explore though. In terms of the combat, it's a turn-based combat that's pretty basic, but it's enjoyable if you enjoy turn-based combat. And my only complaint about it is that you level cap out so early that when you get to the last dungeon, which is the only part of the game that really drags, honestly, once you get to the last dungeon and the final boss battles, the game gets hard because you can't level up anymore. But overall, my opinion on Destiny Connect Tick-Tock Travelers is that it's an enjoyable game, honestly. And if you find it on discount, I would say it's actually a pretty enjoyable RPG that's also short, and I would say it's worth your time. 20 hours for a JRPG is pretty good. It tells an enjoyable story and has enjoyable characters, and the gameplay is fun. And as well, it has a pretty good soundtrack. I only really have 2 complaints about this game, which is the fact that there's no voice actors and that you level cap too quick, which makes the end of the game have a difficulty spike while the rest of the game was pretty easy. But I would say it's worth it at a discount. It's not a must-play game, so yeah, you can skip on it if you want to. It's nothing amazing. I wasn't blown away by it, but I enjoyed my time with it. And if you see it and you're interested, I would recommend playing it because it's enjoyable, and honestly, it's short enough to where you can play it and you can just enjoy it, and it doesn't take up too much of your time. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.